Well, still, I mean, the movement so far is, I think, mass protests, but it hasn't been congealed in terms of organizations. For instance, in the 79 revolution, there were general strikes. After Charles Square, the whole economy basically stopped. The oil workers most prominently, but railways, truck drivers, the whole country went on general strike. And of course, the bazaar went on general strike. So far, there have been some, trade union protests. There's been some bazaars especially in Kurdistan and Baluchistan, but you haven't seen a major shutdown of the big bazaars of Isfahan or Tehran or Mashhad. And there, I would say, I don't have direct information, but my suspicion is that the bazaar is quite divided. There is a fair amount of discontent, but the bazaar organizations are still supportive of the regime. So if you look at historically how many revolutions there have been, they're not that many. And of course, I think the 1979 revolution in Iran was a real revolution. And because of that, I think people expected this recent uprising, to inevitably turn into a similar event. And it hasn't, I think, for one good reason. There's a lot of public discontent. The regime obviously is not popular. It still has some legitimacy, but it doesn't have the legitimacy it had in 1980, 81. It has eroded. It has actually, even I would say, systematically eroded its own legitimacy. So it may have 15, 20% of the population supporting it, but a vast majority, I think, are no longer considered the regime as legitimate. But that's not enough to bring down the regime. The regime itself is still intact, and there's no sign that the regime itself is going to break down. And I don't see the regime as abdicating. But if you look over the course of the last 20 years especially, that has drastically eroded, mainly because the elections have become meaningless. The Islamic reformers have been basically marginalized, neutralized, and the economy is done badly. And it's basically the hope that existed that this regime would evolve into something more open. That has been blocked. And this is a permanent crisis because the people in the street are actually products of the Islamic Republic. But they're not talking the language of Islam. They're talking the language really of the French Enlightenment. What they're talking about is individual rights. So this is, I think, in the long run, these are revolutionary demands that are going to go for basically be a permanent sore for the regime. As long as the regime is there, it's not going to be able to solve this issue. It's not going to be able to brainwash a whole generation that it already had educated to accept its views. So only, I would say, 15 to 20% of the population still thinks in terms of religious legitimacy. The other 80% is very much basically wedded to Enlightenment discourse. No, actually, the main revolutions we've had, except for maybe the Chinese, because Mao Zedong was right, in other major revolutions, when the revolutions began, there were no leaders. I mean, later leaders appeared after the revolution, and then history was projected that they were important. But like in the French Revolution, who was the leader at the beginning of it? In the Russian Revolution, Lenin was an unknown person abroad in Switzerland. So I don't think necessarily leader actually is helpful. Well, it's hard to make predictions because there's always the contingency. You don't know what's going to happen. Unpredictable or stupid things might happen. But if things are as they are and no unsurprising things happen, for instance, there's no Israeli attack or American bombing, which is possible, but if it doesn't happen, our predictions are basically an ongoing instability crisis. The regime is not going to fall, but nor is basically the discontent going to disappear. It'll even increase maybe, but that will lead for further polarization rather than disintegration of the nizam, the regime.